For all for joining the webinar today. We have the pleasure of having Professor Rayner here from the National University of Singapore, Salisbury Hock School of Public Health, National University of Singapore, and National University Health System. He's an assistant professor and leads the Courage Lab at NUS, and he's an implementation and socio-behavioral scientist whose work spans areas of stigma and health, community engagement, and health equity. He has been receiving many awards, including a recipient of the ASEAN Youth Fellowship 2024, Fulbright Visiting Research Scholarship, HIV Infectious Disease and Global Health Implementation Research Institute Fellowship at Washington University in St. Louis. And he's currently the deputy editor of the Journal of the International AIDS Society and associate editor at the International Journal of Behavioral Medicine. He's also head of research at the Greenhouse Community Services Limited, a charity offering substance use recovery services, and a board member of the Project X Society serving the needs of sex workers. In addition to that, he served as a treasurer for the Society of Behavioral Health Singapore and is co-lead the Singapore Mental Health Matters. And I believe your recent interest is in mental health related work, right? In suicide prevention, which I believe I've heard you speak on the topic before. So without further ado, may I introduce Dr. Rayner Tan, please.
Thank you so much, Professor Wong, for the so kind and generous introduction. And I just want to thank you and your team for setting this up and for the privilege of being able to share more, I guess, more about my experience in academia so far. I'm going to share my screen. Okay, so I'm just going to use some slides to share maybe about a bit about me, a bit about my journey so far, some of the work that I do with communities. I think the title of today's talk was around bridging communities and science, right? And maybe I just wanted to share how I've approached it and what has shaped my thinking around that. And just wanted to also share a little bit about my current work and the people that I work with towards the end. But yeah, feel free to put any questions or any comments into the chat in the meantime, as I share a little bit more. Okay, this is my first time going through the slides. I did not practice, so bear with me as I go through it. So I think one thing that's really important about research is we often think about research if we come from the medical sciences or maybe even public health. Sometimes research is about how do we take the researcher out of the research, right? The researcher provides a lot of bias. The researcher should be seen as a bad thing. But actually a lot of the work that I do is around both quantitative and qualitative research. But as a social scientist that was trained in that area before, a lot about what we do is so much about who we are and our own life experiences also. And that's why I kind of wanted to give you a sense of my work. And to do so is to also introduce a bit about my background, right? So I had a lot of fun kind of trying to pull out old pictures from one of my old Facebook accounts. And I think I never really thought of myself to be an academic. I actually grew up not wanting to be in academia because in my family, my parents did not go to university. My extended family, in my generation, I'm the first one to get a degree. So it was not really a big thing for me. In fact, I really wanted to go to business school. So actually, when I first enrolled in university, I applied to the Singapore Management University, which was still pretty new, to the School of Business. But actually at that time, I was also really, really interested in the food and beverage industry. I really wanted to be a chef. And so I also applied to, I think, the Cornell School of Hospitality, and Nanyang Technological University, which is another big university in Singapore, had a joint program, in the Nanyang Business School with Cornell. But in the end, I ended up at SMU because it was the most convenient. It's in the middle of the city in Singapore. And for those of you who have been to Singapore, maybe you might have walked past it because it's right smack in the middle of many different landmarks. So this was my school for a couple of years. But actually, before this business school, I or during I also wanted to be an artist. I wanted to sing and to actually do a lot of music. So music is a very big part of my life as well. I think food, music, they all really touch me, right? They are about people. They're about I guess the human condition, right? This is something that I really enjoyed doing. So actually, before university, I had a short stint in pastry school. And this is a picture of, I don't know where you can find me, but this was like my graduation photo. Um, and I'm somewhere over here. But it was really fun. I enjoyed doing it, but I also started to realize that maybe I'm not the best at it. But anyway, I became a chef actually. I don't know how I did it, but it was actually during my university. My family ran a small pastry cafe while I was studying. But that I think for those of you who have friends or have been in the food and beverage industry, like it's really tough to sustain it. So, we closed down after a while. And actually at that point in time, I was also facing a little bit of like an existential crisis, right? What did I want to do? Was it business? I started to uh move from all the fun modules like marketing, PR. I actually gave up an internship with this PR firm called Edelman to run my own pastry cafe. And like that was something that I wanted to do. The moment I hit the finance modules, the management science, I started to get a little bit more disillusioned, right? Because like finance, I think finance, no criticism of people who are in finance, but to me it didn't make sense to actually have speculate and create value out of basically what I saw as nothing. So that was hard for me to grasp in finance. So I dropped out of SMU midway through my degree. Started to do a little bit more of the family business. It didn't work out. It closed down. And I was at this space in time where, I did not have a degree. I tried all these different things. I wasn't sure what I wanted to do. And, I had, something that I won't cover today is also that, growing up, I had a lot of like issues with my identity as well, right? As someone who grew up as a gay man, and someone who also faced issues with my identity. I had a lot of mental health challenges. And so, I started to get into a lot of substance use, and that was a phase of my life where I was really deep into like addiction, right? And uh, fast forward, I think after I dropped out of school, I went to rehab. And I think in Singapore, some of you might know that the drug laws are really like tough. And so what my parents did was, thankfully I was able to find a psychiatrist that was in the private sector. But in Singapore, if you're a doctor, you have to report everyone to the authorities, right? Like that's the part of the not part of the law, but part of the Singapore Medical Council regulations. So, but I was desperate then. And my counselor, and my psychiatrist suggested that I go to rehab. And in Singapore, we only have one rehab that's mandatory, and that's in the prison. We don't have any voluntary rehab. So I looked overseas. They had a connection with a rehab in Chiang Mai, and that's where I went for about close to 2 months. Right, and this was a picture of Chiang Mai on the left, sitting by the Ping River on a boat. And when you graduate from rehab, you get like a token right on the right side. It says one day at a time. What I really love about this, and it's still my old Facebook account like cover picture. It is it talks about all these different principles of unselfishness, honesty, purity, and love, right? These are some values that I really resonate with, right? I think my idea of doing things like food and beverage, is to really try and honor and create memories for people. Fight to create a space where people can enjoy themselves and like meet friends and socialize. My love for music is also this idea of really bringing people together and being able to enjoy life, right, and thrive. So like these values like kind of resonate with me and still stick with me today. Thankfully, so after that, when I got out of rehab, I was like, oh, I want to go back to school. And my psychologist then really inspired me because actually before rehab, I never knew that there was this thing called mental health. And like I think therapy was inaccessible, it's stigmatized. When I started going through intense therapy, in rehab it was like, everyday group therapy twice a day, and we've got individual therapy 3 times a week. And I started to get so inspired that someone could actually talk to someone and make sense of someone's life in a way that it impacted mine, right? And so when I go back to school, I was like, can I please I sent an email to my dean of the School of Social Sciences, and I put my entire life story there about how I just came out from rehab. Um, and the dean was like, "Oh, we'll be, so great to readmit you." And when I went to his office, he gave me this book by Jonathan Haidt. I think some of you might know that author, called The Happiness Hypothesis, and I still have it somewhere with me. And I think uh, it was such a really nice gesture from the dean of the school to meet me personally, to tell me that he would love to re-enroll me in the School of Social Sciences. And I think that's where my love for the social sciences started to develop, right? And I was so set on becoming a psychologist, but once I started taking the social science module, so for I guess for many universities, when you go into this school or discipline, you have to take like all the 101 courses, right? Like sociology, psychology, and then I was also at this like um fork in the road, right? I started to love so much about what sociology was talking about, that like personal troubles are always connected to public issues. How do we see something as a personal trouble? And like for me, that was very relevant because I always thought all my personal troubles were my fault, were something of a moral failing. And to actually start seeing that a lot of these things were things that were out of my control, were actually a result of structure and systems, was so powerful. And so I set up a consultation with my sociology 101 prof. I set up a consultation with my psychology 101 prof. And I talked to them about, what might be a good career path. And I decided to lean into sociology, because I guess to put it simply, there's so much meaning in uh, person to person kind of change. But also at the same time, what spoke to me was policies that, I felt were in a way, and to be very honest, like unjust to me, right? That I felt like did not serve me well in my life. I wanted to change that. And one thing as I went through my sociology course was to realize that research is such a strong and powerful tool for advocacy. In terms of different things that I saw as needing attention in the world. I think many different people might see different ways of advocating for change. But also in Singapore, I realized being a very technocratically run country, research plays a very strong role. And when it came to issues like HIV or drug use, the thing is that there hasn't been a lot of funding and there's no research. And without research, actually, people don't know what the issues are, for people with lived experience. And so I thought this was one way of, actually identifying, articulating issues that will be relevant for policies too. And so I did my thesis in HIV stigma and discrimination. And it was quite funny because like in SMU, Singapore Management University, a thesis is optional. It's actually a degree with honors by coursework. So I was the only sociology thesis in my year. And of course, because I won the best thesis for sociology because I was the only thesis. But I think it was also such a great experience. I had sheer luck and privilege of having so many wonderful mentors, like the dean I talked about. Because we only have one thesis that year, my supervisor met with me so often to teach me how to do statistical methods. There wasn't a full course on it that I attended, but how to use SPSS, what is regression, how do you deal with the data. Like my professor at the time, who eventually moved to NUS, and we're now colleagues. Um, yeah, she sat down with me in the meeting room, started drawing things on the board, and taught me one-on-one on how to run my thesis, right? And I think that mentorship was something that I truly appreciated. And people always tell me, and my mentors always tell me that you don't have to repay me, you just have to pay it forward. And I think that's something that I carry with me today, right? That all the good luck and the good things that I've managed to get in my life in academia, is something that I try to pay forward as well. I think not to uh draw stay too long on this point about myself, but I think that's where I started to expand my research. I started in HIV stigma and discrimination in sociology. And actually, at the time, I applied for 12 different PhD programs in the US, and I didn't get admitted to any. I got waitlisted at University of Washington, I think. But I think one thing that my mentors told me was that I had applied when I haven't graduated yet. I was still in my final year of university without any conferment. And in the social sciences, you don't need a master's to get a PhD admission, right? Because it's part of your whole process too. I was focusing on social science programs. I applied to NUS Masters of Sociology and I got rejected as well. But in the same year, I applied for a PhD program at the School of Public Health because of that link in health, and I got in. And I think that for me also is like it tells me that like rejection is such a huge part of the process, right? And along the way, I've got more stories to tell about that. So with the School of Public Health, I was also so lucky because many of you might know, especially in Singapore and Hong Kong, right? Like about SARS back in the early 2000s. And in Singapore, they set up this thing called the Courage Fund. The Courage Fund was a fund that was based on the donations towards SARS victims and their families. And as part of the Courage Fund, they set up a scholarship at the school, the School of Public Health, right, to fund PhDs in infectious disease research. And like even though SARS and the Courage Fund might not have had HIV in mind, I was lucky enough to get that scholarship because HIV is an infectious disease, and that's why that's why my lab today is called the Courage Lab, also because I was a Courage Fund scholar that drew on the donations of many different people who wanted um, to 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 contribute, right, to victims of infectious diseases. And having that funding in mind and having that intention and motivation also kind of makes me feel accountable to the kind of work that I do, that also goes back to society as well, right? And I think and of course I have to do a 5-year bond in Singapore, which I'm fulfilling now. But that wasn't the point. I love being here to work on the things that need working on and working with my communities here too. This is the part that gets interesting, right? Because as an NUS PhD, many of you might hear that it might be difficult to get back into NUS as faculty. I don't know whether it's the same everywhere else, right? Graduating from the university that you got your PhD from, getting a tenure track position in the same school would be difficult. And there are good reasons for that, right? I think one of them is that you might be doing the same thing as your supervisor, like that research continues on. And so a lot of resources goes into funding the same projects and not expanding the school's network. And I think there's also the idea of academic networks, right? I think having someone who did their PhD overseas, you kind of bring new networks into the university too. And I was very aware of that and was advised to do two things. One is to go overseas and start building that to justify why I'm similar to someone who did a PhD overseas. And the second thing was to also the best way to do it is get a contract from a top university elsewhere and use that as leverage. I didn't do that because I felt it was a bit weird to get that and then after that burn that bridge by saying I'm just using this as leverage. But I at that point in 2016, 2017, I knew about that because everyone who I talked to advised me and told me that if you do your PhD here in NUS, you have to think about whether you want to work here next time. And one part of my own life history is like I don't like to be told that I cannot do things. Like the moment someone tells that to me, I'll be like, okay, I'm gonna prove you wrong. Like that. And actually back in 2016, 2017, that was my mentality, right? I really did everything that I could from the start of my PhD to prove people wrong and to see how I can do this. And that's why I started publishing quite a bit from like I think the second or third year of my PhD. And like I mean, mental health aside, I mean, I just want to say that it's very bad for one's mental health. I think it was like it helps serve a purpose, but I wish I had more insight and more support, during the whole time. And I did, like I think at the time my partner, like my friends, we had a very strong support network for me, and I think that's how I got through the whole thing. So I did a visiting, and I think one thing that was also really interesting is when I graduated in 2021. That was when we were in the thick of COVID. And so I think maybe it was my luck, that I managed to actually do a few visiting scholarships without actually going to the school. So like I was a visiting scholar at Columbia, and collaborating on things. But actually, I've never been to Columbia as a staff. But like I've got the letter to prove it. So like it's not like fake or anything. But this was that we did publish things together as a result of that short visiting scholarship. I did attend and give some talks there online because it was during COVID. I mean, the only thing was that I had to stay up till like 1, 2 a.m. to like do some of these things, right? But it was a way to get that into my CV. Um, you know, One thing was also, I started attending conferences. I did my first conference in the second year of my PhD, and I was so excited and so happy that I got my first poster presentation at the International AIDS Society. And I remember this was in Paris. And the thing about that was at that time I started to look around, like at other people's work and started to get inspired by people, and not just that, I think in the AIDS society or the HIV and AIDS world, you start to see in the conferences that communities play such a big role in shaping what science should be doing, or the direction in which science can be communicated, right? The science, there's the clinical part that perhaps is shaped by discovery, the innovation. But in implementation sciences, we know that it takes 17 years on average, for discovery to translate into practice, right? But that 17 years can definitely be shortened because communities can advocate for that, and to change systems that help to improve that. So I started to see all these things when I went there, and actually I saw someone's research on uh, uh, like HIV, STI, or sexually transmitted infections testing, and using a pay it forward strategy. Um, and they are based in Guangzhou, and it was out of this unit called University of North Carolina Project China. And so I cold emailed the PI, who is my mentor, Professor Joe Tucker, um, and wrote this long email about why I really wanted to be part of that project. A little bit about my own lived experience as well, and like started to also show my CV. And I think at that time they just got what they called like a NIH, National Institutes of Health, R01 grant, which is a larger grant for like larger randomized controlled trials. And I came on this project for gonorrhea paid forward testing for men who have sex with men in China. Uh, Even though my postdoctoral fellowship was for 2 years, I only spent 8 months in Guangzhou because I needed to get like a few Sinovac vaccines to get the visa. And in Singapore, what that meant was I did the mandatory ones, and then I got a few more vaccines. So by the time I flew to China, I had 5 vaccines in me for COVID. Like I think, and like I'm fine. Like I think, I got in and really enjoyed my 8 months there, even though it was like occasional lockdowns. But actually in Guangzhou, I missed the major outbreak in earlier part of like 2021, I believe. And then, it was actually really smooth sailing all the way till the end. And I left 4 days after all the restrictions were lifted, and a few days before all my colleagues got COVID. So the timing was like impeccable, right? But through that experience, um, I got to learn so much about like overseas grant mechanisms, about the NIH, about Welcome, the UK grant mechanisms. I really do feel that overseas exposure is so important if you are thinking about academic progress, right? And like making new connections as well. I think one thing that also allowed me to enjoy and experience was that I started to take on methods and areas of work that were beyond my PhD. So I did more on like sociology, social sciences approach to public health. I moved on to doing stuff around implementation sciences. I started to I applied to be a fellow at the Washington University IIRI, which is the HIV, Infectious Diseases and Global Health Implementation Research Institute. I got in as one of their fellows. It was still during COVID, so I've never been to St. Louis or Missouri in Washington University. I had to stay up to attend the annual institute, which was like up to like 4 a.m., but it was such a great experience because implementation science was like a new field. Like it's not that new, but the I think the effort to consolidate what it means to do implementation research was growing, and there is a very strong sociological and behavioral scientific element to implementation sciences. And it really spoke to me, right? Because a lot of things about advocacy, a lot of things about uh, research and advocacy was to also bridge that gap between what we see as things that we already have, right? In HIV, for example, we've got sexual health prevention tools, right? We've got like condoms, we've got things like pre-exposure prophylaxis, post-exposure prophylaxis. We've got all these new innovations, but in Singapore, for example, people still find it hard to get pre-exposure prophylaxis here. And there is a science to it, right? There are barriers that are socioeconomic, psychological, political, and I think being able to articulate these things is part of implementation sciences as well. Yeah, and so now I'm affiliated with the NUS Implementation Science School, the Faculty of Arts and Social Sciences, but my primary affiliation is with the School of Public Health. Okay, and I think I will go into very quickly like the why community-based research is so important, right? And I think hopefully my background has also shown you why I privilege this a lot, because I've learned so much about it in the space of HIV science. I've also come with lived experience myself for many of the things that I research. And I think that for me informs the work that I do, but also helps me understand what good research means that can leverage lived experience. And I think the social sciences does that a lot. I like Prof. Wong mentioned, I used to be the chairperson and the director of the greenhouse. Now I just I lead the research team there. I stepped down this year. I was previously president of Project X, which is a sex worker I guess NGO in Singapore, and still remain a board member because someone who definitely is a better fit for president is there now instead of a cisgender gay man. And I think one area that I'm called to, right, because of my history with like substance use. I just got diagnosed with ADHD this year, and started medication. Like mental health is such a huge thing for me, right? I think that's something that is also really, for those of you doing research in HIV, is so intertwined with that. And so one reason why I do this also sometimes, being in academia and doing research, when I get too much into it, I sometimes think to myself, like, what am I doing? And it's what I'm doing making any impact at all. Like I can see the paper, but like I feel so much better when it goes back to my original roots, right? Which is to impact people and to talk to people and see people enjoy their lives. I think this is something that grounds me, right? The community research. But like, does that mean that community research and research don't go hand in hand? I think that's something that is not true, right? I think it's not firstly, they can go hand in hand, and secondly, I have found that we can be mutually beneficial too. Like one doesn't take away from the other. And I think yeah, this is the greenhouse. It's a story for another day, but like after rehab, came back, set up some support groups. It grew thanks to many different people. And it's now a charity today. A story for another day. So, like I think one thing that has been great is with community-based research, a lot of the agenda setting or the like we start from thinking about what the impact should be, right? And I think this is not actually really creating evidence for something because the evidence already exists. We know that people might be suffering in certain circumstances, or we know that this ground up wisdom exists, the logic exists, but no one has written about it or articulated it. And because no one has done that, policymakers have nothing to show, right? That is evidence-based to drive policies. And so for example, with the greenhouse, we've always known that substance use is an issue with, like, say, sexual minorities or minority groups in general. But like, how do we take the conversation away from the moral part of it? That it's criminalized, it's bad, and it's a moral failure. And for us, many of us, our lived experiences tell us differently, right? We're not trying to be bad people. We're not trying to be criminals. But a lot of us do it as a way of coping with life. And a lot of us do it as a result of potential traumas in our life, right, that we've experienced, whether it's like HIV, sexual violence and stuff. So why are good people being thrown in jail in our community? But it's more like hurt people are being thrown in jail. And I think one thing that we wanted to do was also find a way to articulate these lived experiences, but also at the same time, find a way that will inform our programs in an evidence-based way. Because if we want to do interventions that help with these issues, we also need to understand the concerns of the community, right? And that's why we started to collaborate and do work that is published in high impact journals. I think like, for example, this paper was like published in the International Journal of Drug Policy, which I think is one of the leading journals in drug policy. And talks about trauma as a basis for sexualized drug use or drug use as well. And I think this also led, and we use this research to also provide evidence for the type of programs that the greenhouse provides for its clients too. So having this is mutually beneficial for both parties, but at the same time, I think a lot of it is about accountability as academics, because there is a power differential there as well, right? So I think some of these things I started to learn more and more over time. With interventions, actually, one thing that I also found out was that we don't have to develop interventions. Actually, a lot of community groups have interventions that are based on lived experience and what they know best about communities. So instead of developing intervention, why not take something that has already been developed by communities and evaluate it? Because then they can use that evidence as data to get more funding for future programs. And at the same time, I can also publish a paper, as an academic. I think there's impact to that. And so this was actually the final chapter of my thesis, where we evaluated a web drama series on YouTube that was developed by Action for AIDS in Singapore. And it's so interesting because we came up with this idea sitting in a van in Amsterdam with, like, we were attending the same conference. And, as we were driving, from the hotel to the from the conference venue back to the hotel, we were also inspired by all the research there. And because in the van was me, Action for AIDS person, like another colleague, we were like, why not we do something, and why not we try and collaborate to do something like that. And so I applied for a internal seed grant. I got 30,000 Singapore dollars, which I think is about 150K or like 180K Hong Kong dollars, to do this study. And it became the final part of my thesis. And I only got this idea and opportunity about 2 to 3 years into my thesis. So to everyone out there doing a PhD, you don't necessarily need to have everything planned. In fact, me and most of my students start their PhDs without any funding for research, and we find ways to do it because many of them have lived experience too. I'm going to go fast so that I end on time. This is COVID-19 and sex work. One of my mentors helped set up the medical surveillance scheme, or help inform the medical surveillance scheme in Singapore, which is a sexual health testing scheme for brothel-based sex workers, for public health reasons and for medical surveillance reasons as well. And when COVID came, she called me and she said, the government wants to do something, to find out how COVID is spreading in different communities, right? To understand that. And, we all jumped on it. I mobilized some other PhD students who were keen to do work, and we started to do a mixed method study. We went to the red light district. We started to do surveys in collaboration with Project X. And, I think one thing was also finding alignment with communities, right? Why is this research important instead of being exploitative? Because we could be exploitative. We just want to find out, but no action. But I think one thing that we wanted to do was find that alignment, co-develop the protocol together, and then the research findings would align with the advocacy goals of the community groups too. And one of the things that we wanted to really show was that people were forced into situations where sex work would still continue because they don't have any other ways of surviving, right? And I think being able to show that, and being able to show that people do need access to services and to help, I think was an important thing to articulate here. And so we wrote a few papers around this, and we wrote a report to multiple stakeholders in Singapore too. Suicide prevention is something that is also part of my own life history, like a suicidal ideation and all. And I think, it's just an important part, an important thing that I want to be a part of as part of my role at SG Mental Health Matters. But you find out more on suicide prevention if you go to SG Mental Health Matters website. But it was also still a participatory thing, right? And I think one thing I carried with me was this idea that, when communities co-develop protocols, when communities co-develop things, we can also still produce powerful research, because all the studies that I shared earlier were all in like top 10% as like JTR journals, right? And it's not that community-based research is unimpactful, but at least for me, journal articles aside, the thing that allows me to sleep well at night is I know that the research that I've done has led to something that people on the ground can use. That there is no disconnect over there because we created it together. And I think that's something that is important for me. And this leads me to being accountable, right? This idea of shared decision-making power in protocol development is something that I understand as being best practice. And I've seen how, it leads to, benefits for everyone. And mutual ownership, when I come up with research collaborative agreements with community groups, it's always about everyone independently owning the data, right? And I think what as researchers, we have to navigate when doing such work is that a lot of times our grants and our IRBs and our institutions might not be structured in ways that promote these kind of practices. But finding innovative ways of making sure that happens. For example, the COVID grant, we got a grant that funded the school. I don't know where I should say this. I think it's fine. Like we then said, this person is an RA, but this person is going to sit with your community group for 1 year to work as a community researcher, to work on this project. And if there's anything else that involves community building, it's staff at your center. Because when we engage community groups to do research, actually it's more work for them that might not actually translate to their own services or programs, right? But when you have a staff member who's sitting there and doing work throughout the whole time, it's actually extra manpower for them or extra personnel for them. And I think that is important while achieving the goals of the research as well. I think one thing that I try to be accountable to is, like also science communications, right? With the implementation science stuff in mind, trying to make sure that research translates to public education and awareness, and advocating for change is something that I try to do, both in different areas like HIV, like in the repeal of like the law that criminalizes sex between men, or just for queer health in general, like the workplace discrimination laws. A lot of these reports don't count towards my tenure, but I think it's important to also think about the impact that we are making, right? And I'm lucky because my school is a public health school. A lot of people do practice at impact-based research, not necessarily stuff that is published in high-impact journals. And as a school, we are also evaluated based on our practice impact alongside research as well. So I think that the way that the structure is set up also promotes certain behaviors and performance metrics for faculty, right? And I'm very glad that that is something that recognizes my work too. There's the mental health stuff, and this is interesting because we also try to promote more compassionate mental health systems, right? Including like let's say people being arrested for mental health crises. And like trying to promote the idea that interdisciplinary crisis team is important. This is an interesting one because after like it shows that advocacy can also lead to pushback sometimes, right? And I think after we wrote this, like the police wrote back in the forum to kind of just also like protect their interests as well, right? Not to say that they're not doing a good job, but these are some things that we still try to do. And I think this helps to drive the conversation forward, right? We're not being antagonistic to one another, but we are also working towards what I always believe are shared ideas and principles, but the ways that we implement them are different. I don't know, like I did try to run for parliament one time, because I feel like this would be a way of also platforming a lot of different issues that I love doing. Of course, it didn't happen, but who knows, maybe in the future. Um, and it brings me in the last minute, 2 to 3 minutes or so about my lab, right? Like how these things all tie into the values of my lab, which is called the Courage Lab. This is the team that I work with. There are many more photos, but if you're here and you haven't submitted, please submit your bios and photos so that I can include you in my website. But I think these are like staff. I've got a few staff members. A lot of maybe like PhD students, master students. And they all form the lab. And one thing that we all value and do, I think, is to harness lived experience as part of the research that we do. And a lot of my lab members do things that mean a lot to them, maybe themselves or their families or their loved ones. And we try and do that and center that. Um, I would say that almost all of them have no research grant tied to their research. And what we always start with is the passion and the idea that they want to pursue, and we'll find ways and means to do it. Whether it's a community mobilization or working with community groups, because we don't need a grant to do research, and that's something that I've come to learn. Yeah, these are all different projects, that each of the different lab co-leads are doing. So I started a mentorship structure. We do a lot of queer health, queer aging, suicide prevention, HIV prevention work, implementation science work, drug policy, health equity. But you realize that they're all sort of related to stigmatized health issues or issues that are often neglected in the health agenda. And I think a lot of us work with stigma as one of the common themes. I won't talk about mentorship structure, but I think mentorship, I would just say that mentorship is super important for uh, postgraduate and undergraduate thriving, and it's an area that I'm keen to look into, to see how we can improve the mental health and well-being of our students. But, we try and do some structured mentoring, in the lab. And this is something that I learned from my own mentors as well, how to do it. And this is the last slide that I will share. But one thing that I really ties in everything together, my life history, everyone's passion, is this shared principles of a lab, right? Like what are we trying to do as a lab? And I think one of the key principles that we want to do as a Courage Lab is to, honor lived experience for research and practice. Going back to my roots in like, F&B and music, what do we honor about the human condition and being human? And I think what that then leads to is, how do we treat each other at work, in our lab culture, which is around like loving kindness, compassion, like all the things in that token that I got from rehab around accountability. I think those things, those principles sometimes come into conflict with one another, right? Like research is a very high performing, taxing and very demanding field, right? But how do we do that? Recognize that we all come from different histories and different challenges in a space of time, but also still remain accountable to what we need to do. I think that is a challenge, and but it's something that we try and work out together, right? And it also shapes the types of areas that we work on in terms of health equity, social impact, advocacy, and the stuff that we do for research. And one thing that I realized that when all those things align, actually research excellence comes naturally. We never think about, oh, we want to publish in the Lancet or we want to publish here. That's a good thing to think about as an academic, but most of the time, it's like when these things happen and we finally have the product, we end up publishing in like excellent journals anyway, and that is at the bottom of this like pyramid. So, I think there's something to be said about thinking through the principles first of why we do things before we, chase some of these things. And it's something that I try to convince myself too, because I'm not very good at doing that. When you have I guess when you are socialized into chasing um, excellence, your behaviors kind of drive towards that. But I'm trying to do more of the principled approach. But anyway, I think that's pretty much it from me. Thanks so much for giving me the time to share.
Yeah, thank you very much, Rayner, for the excellent, inspiring talk. I listened to your talks before, and I always found your talks is full of passion, honesty, um, and um, and this almost like a calling for you to do something for the community. Am I right? Is public health your calling, you would say?
I think so. I think I, as a field, it's so diverse. But what I realize is that the people in public health are very aligned. Everyone wants to do good work for different communities and to improve health. And, like everyone's also a lot of the times quite, like kind and compassionate people that I work with too. And that's the calling that I have, I think.
Mhm. We have some question from the audience. Um, from one of them, thank you for your sharing. May I ask what really inspires you to do HIV research?
Yeah, wow, this is a this is a very interesting question. I mean, I've actually never really hit like you can't find it written anywhere, but like in talks, I also share about my own journey with HIV and being diagnosed when I was like I think when I was 20 years old. And it was also because I actually went to a doctor to get post-exposure prophylaxis, but I couldn't afford it, and after that, I couldn't tell my parents. And this was like one of the things that carried with me, like forward as barriers to health, but also at the same time, drove a lot of the initial research that I did, right? And like one thing that I've never tried to do is to let something define me. I am not a single identity, right? And that's why I never actually tried to leverage that as a way of advocacy. And I think that works well, right? Because there's so many things you learn in one area that translates into the strengths of other areas too. As someone who's a HIV scholar, someone who's, let's say, a minority research scholar, stigma scholar, now I'm working in youth mental health too. So like I will never be I will be a HIV scholar by profession. People will know me in that field, but I'm never defined by that one area of work. So, you can see that lived experience informing that, but also, it carries on to many different parts of academic work too.
So we have another question. As students and recent graduates, what do you think could be the first few steps we can take to bridge science and community impact?
Um, I think that's a great question. If if I look at uh, my own trajectory, like I would say that I've had the privilege of starting with the communities and working from there, right? Like I was volunteering, I was doing all these things, I had certain lived experiences, but I also realized that many of us might not want to do that, right? Like for me, um, my work and like my existence are intertwined. There are pros and cons to that. Many of the people that I work with in my lab, that's their case for them also, right? They do work in areas that they're passionate about and they live through. Um, Many of us might not want that, and that's totally okay. And in these cases, I think it's also important that we think about the work that we do and see how we can also embed ourselves in community voices, right? Like to make sure that the science that we do, is something that is also what communities want. Because when the disconnect is there, actually what we're doing is we're trying to. It's weird, right? You do science to impact health or impact positive outcomes for people, but the people for whom you want to impact is not part of that. And I think,
Mm,
being able to understand that is important.
thank you. Another question, very inspiring talk. This might be a naive question from someone outside the social science field, but given that LGBTQ topics and STI-related conversations are still considered sensitive or taboo in many Southeast Asian countries, how challenging was it for you to find participants, and what has your experience been like conducting research in this space?
I think yeah, thank you so much for the question. It's true. I think while if I when I came in, everyone told me don't do HIV because HIV is not well funded. And truly, have I ever? I think I've not gotten anything more than like 50K worth of grants in Singapore, like 300K Hong Kong dollars worth of grants for HIV for the work that we do. Um, but if you look at my CV, it's also like 50% HIV work. So actually grants don't translate to research, right? And I think one thing that there are two things that you bring up. One is, maybe difficulties in getting that support. I think when you engage the communities, actually a lot of this work is in part driven by them as well. So I don't need to find participants because the communities already have people who are so willing to talk and so willing to drive change, and partnering with communities allows me to also achieve that. Um, the second thing is the sensitivities, right? And I think um, I don't know, in a funny way, people I guess also ask me like, oh, how do you do all these things but still manage to survive, or like still manage to um, still be in a space that allows you to do the research that you do. And I think it also boils down to my identity, right? Like I'm not a like I by objectively you can call me like a HIV advocate or like a LGBTQ advocate, or like but I think one thing that is also good for me is that I advocate for so many things. Like no one will ever label me as being like a single advocacy thing, right? Like I advocate for things that might not sometimes be in the same category as the other thing. Like youth mental health, or I also advocate for minority research for like let's say low-income migrant workers, or I guess racism in Singapore, right? And sometimes when you think about certain religious affiliations or racism, like it doesn't necessarily be in the same bucket as LGBTQ plus advocacy, because maybe there are certain tensions, right, across religion and culture with these things. But the underlying principle that I have is that everyone's stories like deserve to be told, and when you think about the lived experience and the suffering that comes with stigma, as a minority person, actually that's the thing that bonds everyone together. So like I think that has maybe in some way shielded me from being labeled as someone who has a singular purpose, or is trying to drive a particular agenda. Because what I really want to do is to to do that, to leverage my principles to do good work, and to drive methodological innovation in that area. So yeah, I think that covers the sensitivity part.
Very good. So I have another question actually from my PhD student. Um, Understanding that you have mentioned that no prior funding, we just talked about that, was secured in most of the cases, especially on HIV. Was it difficult to secure funds from donors, funders, and what should we prioritize if we are to conduct community-based participatory research?
Yeah, I think when we go through the lens of shared decision making and mutual benefits, even if there's no funds, so like if you think about the grant funding from an academic funder, like I think 70% most of the time I go into like uh personnel, like research personnel. Maybe another 30%, that's where like the other operating expenses, consumables, depending on which field you're in. In my field, a lot of it is around the people, right? The researchers, the training. And I think one thing that I've been very lucky to do, I'm not saying that people shouldn't be paid. Everyone should be paid. And that is like a non-negotiable, right, for the work. And I always try and do that. But a lot of times urgent things come up, right, around research. Urgent things come up around policy, and people want to do something and want to mobilize that. And I think being able to, as an academic, coming in to say that if you want to do meaningful research, my expertise is to show you how to get to a peer-reviewed, like robust kind of scientific evidence, based on your needs. And I'm going to guide that process. And throughout that process, I also mentor people. And that's why I sleep very little, because like a lot of the times you got to mentor so many people. And we've had like studies with like citizen science, right? Where you've got like 20 to 30 volunteer research assistants. They're all not paid, but it's 20 to 30 people who want to spend 4 hours of the time every week with you. That's better than having like one. Okay, it's not better than having one RA. I love having RAs too, but like you can see how many things can happen without funding. But as a convener, or as a person who mobilizes people, a lot of the work is on you. And I think the only reason why I'm surviving now is because I have a psychiatrist and I've got a therapist who I talk to, very occasionally. Yeah.
And you have time to sleep.
Yeah, actually, contrary to popular belief, I sleep at least like 6 to 7 hours every day.
Okay, the next question is from a student who's from Hong Kong, but you're studying in NUS in your program. So you have shared candidly about your personal journey and the challenges you have faced, considering the stigma and social desirability pressures within traditional Chinese culture. How have you navigated discrimination both personally and professionally? And to what extent Have these cultural barriers influenced or posed obstacles, opportunities to your research and advocacy efforts? You're Chinese, right? Am I right?
Yeah, yeah. Uh, I think so. I partly answered that with maybe like my positionality, um, not being labeled as like not being overly simplified as someone with like a single agenda. Um, I think my work shows for that. I would say that the other thing that I do is also being very pragmatic, right, with the ways that we communicate and the ways that we understand where people are coming from. And what I love is that if your underlying principles are compassion and loving kindness, you need to show that to people who are adversarial to you too, right? And as a qualitative researcher, social scientist, I get fascinated when people challenge me. And like I think understanding where these things come from and the limitations that we're working with helps me also understand why I'm being discriminated or things like that, right? And that changes the way that I talk to people and frame certain things too. I won't go to an NUS talk with a title on LGBT advocacy, because then I'm setting myself up for failure, right? But if I stick true to my principles, am I still doing a disservice to the community if I don't do that? I don't think so, because the ways that I frame it are then a little bit different. I frame it in health, I frame it in equity, I frame it in languages that different institutions and people might understand. And that, actually then doesn't make people allergic to you. People, once people are afraid that when you're labeled as a single person, as an advocate, if you're labeled as someone who wants to push a certain agenda, people will then have that mindset that, we're not going to hire this person or not going to involve you because you are going to push that agenda. But, for me, I just want to do the good work. And, in certain spaces, I can call that advocacy. But in certain spaces, they understand it's the same thing, but it's within the language that they use. So I think being very strategic and pragmatic about the ways that we communicate and maybe position ourselves is something that is important to
Mhm.
survive.
I believe you'll be a great mentor for students and trainees and graduate. And someone asked whether your lab is hiring right now.
Well,
You see how inspiring your talk has been, that people actually want to work for you. And I can understand why you have so many people volunteer to work for you.
I would love to say that I'm hiring, but like I already one thing is it's inspiring to see how much work we can do without money, but also without money I cannot hire people. But occasionally things come up, right? But that's why I think like 80%, 90% of my lab are postgraduate students because there's scholarships that fund students, and I love mentoring and I love supervising. That gives me a lot of joy. And my lab is literally, I'm not literally, but it's just really my family, right? I see everyone as a family member here, because a lot of my values and my principles are in mentorship as well.
Mhm. And one last question from Singapore. Where might you recommend individuals with limited research background but keen to contribute in community-based research work to volunteer?
I think I would say that when we do research with communities together and we do engagement, um, we don't I think it's wrong to expect communities to be researchers. Everyone brings to the table different expertise, right? For me, it's also not saying that communities need to take the lead in research or doing some of these things, because communities sometimes don't have the expertise too. And like it's recognizing all our strengths and weaknesses. And with that mindset, I think if you don't have the research experience and if you're part of a certain community, actually, being willing to share your experience, share expertise by experience, is an important thing. And there are many different platforms to do that. Maybe there's some advisory groups, there's some patient engagement groups for different things. Look into your own communities and look into your own health systems. There are opportunities there. And if there aren't, you can make your own. Like the greenhouse started out as a support group that we started to run together. We put in an 8-week program and a almost like a course, right, to introduce people to addiction because there was none available. And, we were in a way trying to uh, make sure that we had that for ourselves, because the system doesn't have it. So, I think there are ways to drive that and to do that strategically as well.
Mhm. So before we end, do you have any you know, advice or take-home message for, especially for students and trainees here and in the talk today? So and actually, I'm curious to know where's your courage come from?
I, I think, yeah, I, ooh, that's a good question. I'm a bit stumped. I think it comes from, I mean, in a way, it comes from having lost everything once, right? And you have
Loss of
nothing to
relevance.
fear.
Hmm.
So like I think I often see my life as a bit of like a bonus life now. Like I'm not supposed to be alive in some ways, and I think maybe that has really shaped the way that I approach things. And like what's the worst that can happen, right? I I starting to realize that a lot of my self-worth was put in academic achievement. But because of like therapy and mental health, like support, a lot of it now is I'm trying to figure out who I am because I've always been defined by other things, academic excellence. And now that I'm starting to feel who I am, whether I get tenure or not, I would still love that for the record. If anyone in NUS is listening, I would love that. But it doesn't actually define me anymore, or at least I try not to let it define me. And I think being able to find your voice and being able to then, work on principles rather than, what people want you to do or want you to be, is a better life worth living. And I think that's where the courage comes from, right? Like it's just acting on principles rather than what people want me to be, but at the same time being strategic about it. I think
Mm.
there's an art to it.
And your principles are being honest, pure,
Yeah,
unselfish,
purity.
and loving. Is it the four values of your lab? Is that the
Yeah,
principles
yeah.
that you adopt for when you are, moving in this complicated world?
I think so. I think those are the values that I have, and I think I can die well if I've lived my life with those values. Like I think the world will pull you away from some of these values most of the time, right? I think the way that structures and systems are set up sometimes can be dehumanizing, and I think in this era somehow the phrase being human and like preserving our human condition and humanity is like the most important thing for me. Yeah, and I try to do that maybe in everything that I do. Sometimes the system makes you, or you have to do things that are contrary to that, but finding innovative ways to still honor that is something that maybe we can try to do more.
And be courageous about it.
Yeah, and I mean, to nuance that, it's hard. I've had my own privileges in life. Sometimes to be courageous involves privilege too. But I think when you have privilege, uh, you have to share it. Yeah.
Well, thank you very much for the very inspiring talk, and I hope that I will meet you in person or, invite you to Hong Kong sometime. So again, I believe our students and trainees will have substantially benefit from this inspiring talk. So thank you very much again, and hope to see you again. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Thanks, Alice and Xin Qi, for also
Yeah, thank
organizing
you.
this. Really appreciate it.
Yes, thank you.
Thank you.